Okay, guys, just want to go over this really quick since this was a big faux pas that was done by Nikki Haley. Something that opened her up easily to be criticized by both the left and the right. Now, she said that, well, very specifically, she would not mention slavery as the cause of the Civil War. And that's an oversimplification of what the Civil War was actually caused by. Now, if you guys aren't aware, what exactly started the Civil War was that when the states were first formed, the northern states often didn't have slaves, while the southern states did. Now, a lot of the time, what would happen was that every time a new state was added to the Union, if it was in the South, it would have slavery. If it was in the North, it didn't. And over time, the two sides were completely balanced. Each new state being added would then have another state added to the south or the north that would be the opposite. So if a slave state was added, then a free state was added. If a free state was added, then a slave state was added. This worked for a while, but as they kept going, they realized, the Northerners did, that all men created equal meant that slavery was not a moral good. Now, the South was heavily involved in plantation work. Many of the people who were in the South didn't actually own a plantation. They lived in small towns or communities or owned small farms that they farmed on their own. However, the rich plantation owners often had dozens, if not hundreds, of slaves. Many of the founding fathers were slave owners, including Thomas Jefferson, who was a Federalist, and George Washington, who was not an anti-Federalist, but he was more sympathetic to them than he was to the Federalists. Now, he freed his slaves upon his death. In fact, one of his slaves, the one that you see in the picture of him, I almost said poster, in the picture of him riding his horse, you can see that there's a black slave that's riding right beside him. That was his adjutant at the time. His valet, if you want to call it that, who served with him throughout the entire Revolutionary War. That slave eventually escaped and left George Washington's service. But the fact of the matter is that George Washington never lost track of him. He knew where he was the entire time. In fact, he sent letters to the guy telling him, hey, look, listen, I know you want to be free. I get it, it's fine, but it's a little bit of an embarrassment to me that you left without me actually freeing you. Can you please come home? And the guy never did. But George Washington never sent anyone after him. After George Washington died, his will specifically freed all the slaves. Anyone that was too old or too young were allowed to stay on the actual plantation, and they were taken care of until the young were old enough to actually leave and the old had passed away. Meanwhile, anyone that was of age was given enough money and experience and education to actually live on their own. This was part of George Washington just being so old and he wasn't decrepit, but he was just so old after the Revolutionary War that he was mostly not blind, but he couldn't read anymore without reading glasses. He had stopped a second Revolutionary War, by the way. He actually prevented his soldiers from revolting when they didn't receive pay, which they would never receive because, the United States was poor and there was no Federal Reserve and there wasn't a federal currency at the time. Now, a lot of people actually blame the Civil War on the Federal Reserve, but the Federal Reserve and central banking actually existed by the time of Andrew Jackson, who I believe was another slave owner, but don't quote me on that. He was actually a Democrat. Very interesting guy. A lot of people have a lot of interesting things to say about him, and very specifically, they want to call him a monster. Not going to go into that right now. Jefferson, on the other hand, actually wrote the Declaration of Independence and helped write the Constitution. And a lot of people call him out for being a hypocrite because he never freed his own slaves. The only problem with that is that he was so poor by the time that he actually passed away that he didn't technically own his slaves. You see, he was so heavily in debt that the banks took away his right to sell the slaves because they were basically taken as collateral. They were still allowed to work and live on Jefferson's plantation, but Jefferson couldn't free them because he didn't technically own the rights to. Because if he had and he was failed to pay back his debts, there would be nothing for the bank to take from him in order to cover the debt. Yeah, that very, very disturbing. But anyways, over time, eventually what occurred was that Kansas was added into the Union. Kansas actually being further to the west than Arkansas, or Arkansas, is. Now, when Kansas was added, a lot of people flooded into the area, including a guy named John Brown, fighting over the land in order to turn it into a free or a slave state. Now, if you actually look on Wikipedia, if you want to believe Wikipedia, the creation of the Democrat Party was pretty linear. It went from the Federalists to the Democrat Federalists, and then eventually to the Democrats. The Republican Party, on the other hand, was created in a much more complicated fashion. There were many parties that split off from the Democrats over time, and the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists eventually forming the Whig Party as the main party, and eventually, like, all these parties split off from both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Sometimes they would split off so that the majority would go to the Democrat Party and the minority would go to what eventually formed the Republican Party. But the main thing to worry about is that the Whig Party eventually led to the Republican Party. Now, the Republican Party was specifically formed to help free the slaves because they believed that slavery was a moral evil. This concerned a lot of Southerners, specifically the plantation owners. When Abraham Lincoln was actually put up for office as the first Republican, by the way, he was originally a Whig, and if you listen to Razor Fist is of the opinion that Lincoln is a tyrant. I'm not going to go into it right now, but I sort of disagree with him. There's a lot more to that story than what Razor Fist actually gets into, but I really respect his opinion and his research. I just don't completely agree because it ignores the fact that the war was being put off for decades at this point. There was a lot of things that actually led to the Civil War, but the main modus of how it happened was slavery. But it wasn't the only thing. People blame central banking as part of it. That's also an oversimplification. But when Lincoln was actually elected, the Democrats had taken off Lincoln from the ballot in the South in many states, much like they're doing to Donald Trump right now, which Donald Trump very smartly has mentioned often, as what happened after what just happened in Colorado, where they tried to take him off the primary ballot. But as I mentioned in my previous video, Trump wasn't actually taken off the primary ballot. They basically said that he stays on until the Supreme Court looks at it. But if the Supreme Court doesn't look at it, then they're going to take him off the ballot. But the assumption is that the Supreme Court is going to side with Donald Trump on that. Anyways, Civil War. When Lincoln was actually elected, he said that I am not going to free the slaves. A lot of Southerners didn't believe him. And there's all indications that said that Lincoln was actually being straight about this, specifically because he knew that if he tried to free the slaves, there would be a civil war. Lincoln very specifically wanted to send a lot of the slaves back to Africa, to the colony of Liberia. Now, Liberia is a whole nother topic of itself, but a lot of free and former slaves were sent there to colonize it a lot of the infrastructure was built by white people, and a lot of the money and resources were given to them. And then after a while, eventually Liberia was given its freedom and was allowed to continue as it was. But at that point, the slaves and the freemen being people who were never slaves but were also sent there, realized that they had basically nothing in common with the local African tribes, and in fact, they eventually enslaved the locals in a fit of irony that is not lost on a lot of people. Lincoln basically wanted to do the same thing and send them all there, thinking that the racial tensions would be too much in America and that it would make things better that way, and to just get them away from their enslavers and to right a generational wrong, as he kind of believed it. And he figured it would be just a better all-round reason. Again, Lincoln, Razorfist points this out, Lincoln really didn't care that much about actually ending slavery, and people think he just joined the Republican Party in order to gain power. However, there is the fact of the matter that he did want to free the slaves. He just believed that they were culturally different from Americans due to the fact that they were actually culturally different from other Americans. They had their own culture, oftentimes, in the South. If you had a northern business owner talk to a southern slave, they would have basically nothing in common. Now, again, though, when they actually sent former slaves and freemen to Liberia, they had nothing in common with the Africans and ended up enslaving the Africans. So there was no winning on this one. There was just going to be a cultural division between the freed slaves and the free men. Well, the free men were more culturally assimilated since they actually could live free like most northerners. But the fact of the matter is that there was going to be cultural tensions no matter what happened. So Lincoln was basically misguided in this. Anyways, a lot of the southern states actually seceded as soon as Lincoln was elected. Before that, John Brown, who I mentioned earlier, tried to actually take a bunch of weapons from an armory, and he was going to use it to, with his posse, he was going to use the arms to actually arm a lot of the slaves and cause a slave uprising. He was a big proponent of the Republican Party at the time, and, well, he failed, was captured, and I think was executed. Now, when Lincoln was elected, a lot of the Southerners believed that conflict was inevitable. So a lot of them seceded because they didn't want to lose their slaves. But a lot of states actually did not secede yet, including states like Texas and Louisiana, I believe. I believe Louisiana was a state at the time. I believe. I'd have to double check that. I think it was 1848 when Louisiana was added, but don't quote me on that. I could just be making that up off the top of my head. But anyways, they took over Fort Sumter. Now this is where Razorfist kind of goes off the rails, because he says that, well, then Lincoln sent in a warship kind of hoping that they would be shot at. Well, duh. Because Lincoln didn't want to be the one to start the war, and he didn't want to be the one to shoot first. And the Confederates had no idea whether or not Lincoln would actually start a conflict. But the fact of the matter is that was federal land, and it was owned by the United States government, something that the Confederates, in theory, should not be able to secede with, even if it was technically in their territory, because it didn't belong to the state in which, that seceded. So it was technically land theft. The Confederates fired first, and Lincoln declared the Civil War, at which point the rest of the states decided to make this about states' rights, saying that, hey, states should be allowed to secede and we slightly care about slavery, but I mean, you're taking away our rights to choose, therefore they seceded. The Confederates then used that as propaganda to say that all the states in the South only cared about states' rights, despite the fact that that wasn't the case. While states' rights was a big part of it, actually keeping the slaves was also a big part of it. Now, they specifically, this is something that Goobus Dubus has also talked about. And oh my god, that's so silly to say out loud. But he actually made a video on this. It's like, states' rights to what? And he's of the opinion that it's states' rights to hold slaves, since that was specifically put into the Southern Confederates' Constitution. But it was also the states' rights to secede. It's a little bit more complicated, just because you can't make it. You can't simplify things. History is not black and white. If you guys also weren't aware, a lot of the tensions were building up. For instance, one congressman had specifically said that he didn't want states to have slaves, and he was basically beaten over the head with a cane until he was brain damaged, and it took him months to heal. And the Southern Democrat who beat him was sent a whole bunch of canes in congratulations, to the point where a lot of people actually came to Congress armed. This was before the states actually seceded. When a lot of the states seceded, they obviously took a lot of the Democrats with them. Some of the Democrats actually stayed if they were from the North, and would sometimes argue for the states' rights to do it, but a lot of them also didn't agree. For instance, my ancestor, Charles Latour, was a Northern Democrat. He wasn't in Congress or anything, but he fought on the side of the Union. Now, I wish I kind of knew why he's decided to do that, if he actually believed that the state shouldn't have slaves, or if he specifically did it because he didn't want the United States to break apart. I'm not sure. A lot of soldiers' opinions also changed by the end of the war, and the Northern Democrats in Michigan eventually, kind of ruined this state. But that wouldn't really technically happen for like another 100 years or so. But they basically, when the Northern Democrats came back to Michigan, they kind of set up the dominoes to fall, so to speak. Again, another topic for another time. But anyways, people like Razorfist blames Lincoln specifically for causing the Civil War because he sent the warship down to the South. But I never liked that excuse, simply because it takes all agency out of the Confederates for the decisions they made. I mean, someone pulled the trigger, and they kept pulling the trigger. Not saying the Confederates necessarily should have surrendered, but they should have surrendered. Because, for the love of God, they were taking away federal land, and they were fighting for slavery, basically. And they knew what they were fighting for. A lot of them really, really didn't like black people. It was kind of understandable, because they're like, hey, if you take away our slaves, then we won't be able to afford to actually ship food cheaply or cotton cheaply. Therefore, we would be screwed. But it's just stupid. You could just sell your goods for more money. That's how supply and demand works. It would make everything more expensive in the North too. But the Northerners didn't really care that much. They just didn't want slavery. So anyways, I'm going to make this only 20 minutes long. But Nikki Haley totally botched it. The people who tweet for Joe Biden, specifically the same people who text for Jean Pierre, which may be Jean Pierre, because if you forget, Jean Pierre's account once accidentally tweeted out a tweet specifically meant for Joe Biden's tweet. It said something along the lines of, when I was elected president. So whoever tweets for John Pierre, which may be John Pierre, but doubtful, it's probably her actual, the people who work for her. They also tweet for Joe Biden, but the Joe Biden account tweeted out, it was about slavery. Yeah, it was about slavery, you Democrat. Who also, the Democrats were the ones with the slaves, the ones who made Jim Crow, the ones who formed the KKK, and the ones who formed affirmative action. Affirmative action being that Democrats apparently believe that black people are too stupid to finish high school without a handicap and can't get into college without that same handicap, and therefore they need to give black people free admission. And they say the party's switched. I saw one stupid account on Twitter actually say that all the Southern Democrats just magically decided to switch to the Republicans after Jim Crow was finally knocked down and the Civil Rights Act was created. I'm seeing a lot more racism in the Democrat Party nowadays, especially with affirmative action, especially since Joe Biden came out and said that if you don't vote for him, you ain't black. But I'm just gonna, 22 minutes, but still. Nikki Haley botched it. Joe Biden's wrong. Democrats are still racist. It's the same thing as it always is. Anyways, guys, that's it for now. See ya.